CCG China and the World Dialogue Series, China and the World in Era of Crisis and Renewal, a conversation with Financial Times Chief Economics Commentator, Mr. Martin Wolf. This program is presented by the Center for China and Globalization. Pleased to present the presider of this dialogue, CCG President, Dr. Wang Huiyao. Dr. Wang, please.
Thank you, Anne, and good afternoon, good morning, and also to our all audience in China and in other parts of the world. So this is really a great opportunity to have this dialogue with a global opinion leader, Martin Wolf, actually. So this is a CCG dialogue, China and the world in the area of crisis and renewal. And this is actually a series of dialogue we had lately. We had actually already talked with Carrie Brown. We have talked with Graham Allison, Thomas Friedman, Joseph Nye, Anthony Satch. And this actually is the 6th episode of a dialogue. We're very honored to have Martin Wolf with us today. My name is Henry Wang Huiyao, of course, the founder and president for Center for China and Globalisation. Martin Wolf is a well-known global opinion leader, one of the world's most influential financial writer, as we all know that. He's the associate editor and chief economic commentator at the Financial Times. And also, he was awarded the command of the British Empire in 2020 for service for financial journalism. He's a graduate of Oxford University and an honorary fellow of Newfield College of Oxford University. And also, he was awarded the honorary degree of Doctor of Letters by the University of Nottingham, and also was made Doctor of Science Economics of University of London by the London School of Economics. So Mr. Wolf is well known and well established in the financial, economic, and world affairs at large. He was also a senior economist, actually. He had a very impressive professional life. A senior economist with the World Bank between 1971 and 1981 for a decade. And he joined the Financial Times in 1987, where he has been the associate editor since 1990 and chief economic commentator since 1996. So we all read Martin's column regularly. I mean, you are really very influential in terms of the financial and economics arena around the world. So Wolf has been named in the top 100 list of the global thinkers by The Prospect and by Foreign Policy magazine. He's the author of highly regarded books, including Why Globalization Works. This is the book that I'm having today, Why Globalization Works. I bought this book actually at the UN head office in New York, actually a few years back, but it's still well selling. And he has another book, Fixed Global Financing, and his most recent book is on the global financial crisis, the shifts and the shocks, what we have learned and still to learn from the financial crisis. So all his books actually has been translated by the China CITIC Press. And this dialogue is actually in partnership with China CITIC Press as well. And so that we are very glad to have Dr. Wolf with us. He's a stalwart participant in the annual China Development Forum, which I met Martin quite a few times, and also I met you in Singapore and elsewhere in the world. You're a frequent speaker throughout the world. So good morning, Martin, and great to have you. And maybe you can say a few words to our audience here and other parts of the world.
So first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for having invited me. It's also an honor. I'm always amused when people introduce me as a commander of the British Empire, which just shows, as I like to say, that whatever the British have lost in the last century, they haven't lost their sense of humor, since obviously the British Empire disappeared very, very long time ago, which was a good thing, in my view. I'm very pleased to have this dialogue on a crucial subject at a crucial time. We are going through extraordinary transformations in the world order because of economic developments, because of political developments, and of course, because of the pandemic. So we are all being forced to rethink our view of the world, how it's going to evolve. And I've come to the view, I'm just completing a book on the future of the West, but I have come to the view that this decade is looking increasingly what I refer to as a hinge of history, one of those decisive moments in human affairs, which will determine the future of our world for a long time. Will it be prosperous and peaceful? Will we manage our big challenges, above all climate? Will we manage to cooperate satisfactorily, or will the order we have created in the last 20 or 30 years, the order of global cooperation for all its failures, of globalization, will it collapse? And I think those issues are very much live, and the next 10 years or so is likely to provide us with answers. And I have to say, I myself, I'm very concerned about the developments we see. I've been around, as has been noted, for a long time. And I think this is possibly the most challenging period of my lifetime. I was born, I should say, immediately after the Second World War, so I didn't experience that catastrophe. But I've been alive now for 75 years, or very nearly. And this is a very challenging period we're now entering.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And absolutely, you've been around for quite some time, and you witness all these great challenges. But as you said, I agree with you. You know, it's probably the current contemporary challenge we are facing is unprecedented in this 100 years probably. And also, of course, with this pandemic swept all over the world, and also with the economic slowing down around the world, we're actually seeing a transformation going on of the global economy, and a global economy struggling to catch up. So 2021 is projected probably to be the year of recovery. So maybe you could give a bit of the outlook. I mean, since the financial crisis, we're having this pandemic crisis again. You are a great expert on crisis. I mean, you wrote 2 books on those financial crises now. So I'm glad you're having a new book comes out. But what about this, currently with this pandemic crisis? I think it's going to reshape the global economy, and also the political landscape, and also change the way the global governance is reconducted. So perhaps you can share some light on that first.
Well, there's so much to say. I'll try and keep it brief. So the first point is the one you noted. We've now had 2 very significant global crises in less than 15 years. So the last one was the Western financial crisis, which I think of 2007 to 9, but it went on in Europe to 2015. So it was a long crisis. And then just a few years later, we were hit by the pandemic. And while that was an event that many had predicted that such a thing could happen, indeed, it's not at all surprising. Humanity has had a long history of experiencing pandemics. Nevertheless, we didn't know when it happened, and then it happened. And that's been another huge shock. And in a way, so far as I can see, it's the most global economic crisis there has ever been, in the sense that it affected more countries in the world, basically pretty well every country in the world, more profoundly than any other comparable event at least in modern times. And when I think of modern times, I mean really since the Industrial Revolution, so about the last 2 centuries or so. Of course, there have been immense, much more damaging pandemics in the past. We think of the Black Death in the 14th century, but that was so long ago that obviously the memories have largely gone, except in the history books. Now, if we think of the pandemic, so it was global, it was sudden, and it led to a very, very sharp contraction last year, particularly in the first half of last year, across a very large range of economies, and particularly in the West, but also a bit earlier in China. Now, what can we say about this in terms of its social and economic effects? I think we can say the following things. The first, which in a way is the most interesting and important, is how big the economic damage was of an event that, at least as a pandemic, in terms of its fatalities, was historically relatively minor. So I've been looking at the famous Spanish, what we call the Spanish flu of 1918, so just over 100 years ago. Now, nobody knows exactly how many people died then, but the estimates are probably about 50 million. The central estimate is about 50 million, which, given the population growth, will be equivalent to 200 million now. And so far, this pandemic has killed, thank God, fewer than 3 million. So it's a much smaller pandemic in its health effects, but its economic effects have been much bigger. As far as we know, of course, we didn't measure economies in the way we did before. We do now 100 years ago, but it's silly much bigger. Why is that? This is the most important point. The important point is our societies, and I think this is a very good thing, have an enormous value on human life. And we are prepared to pay enormous economic prices in order to protect human lives. And that was clear in China, when you closed down Wuhan, for example, in order to contain the virus, whatever it costs. And the same was true all across the Western world. We basically closed down our economies. People stayed at home. So even in relatively poor countries, there were lockdowns. So we really care about human life. That's the first really big lesson. And I think that's fantastic. And the second thing we learned is we have the means to do something about it because our technology has advanced so much. So that we have learned, as we're now experiencing with this Zoom call, we have learned that with modern technology, and we couldn't have done this even 10 years ago, that we can run much of our modern economy without physically meeting. Now, that generates huge inequality in our societies because the people who can do it this way tend to be the more prosperous, the people with graduate degrees. These are the sort of people who can work at a distance. By and large, the great exception, of course, is the medical profession, obviously. By and large, people with degrees have been pretty safe. People who have to work face-to-face with other people have not. And that has created huge social divisions as a result of the pandemic, and also great divergence among countries because some countries having more advanced economies are able to do much more online than others. So that's the inequality point we've learned. That very, very important. The third thing we've learned is the immense advances in medical science and our ability, which nobody really believed a year ago, to create billions of vaccines, which work, very clearly work, and produce them quite a multiple and distribute them very unevenly and very unequally across the world, is also an extraordinary lesson. Now, what does this mean? And this is my last point for the immediate future. The countries that have either controlled the disease successfully by other means, notably China, but also South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, have reopened pretty well. China's economy is growing, of course, very strongly. And of course, the countries that have managed mass vaccination programs, like the US and now the UK, and over the next few months, Europe, will also expand very rapidly. So I expect a big global recovery this year and next, led by the big economies, basically the big Western economies, the advanced Asian economies in China. And that is, after all, most of the world economy. I mean, that's taken together, that's about 75, 80% of the world economy, roughly. Unfortunately, there are lots of other countries which are in much worse situation. They don't have the vaccines yet. They're very dependent on tourists who are still not going to travel. They have some very big problems. Look at India, look at Africa. And then there's the very final thing, the remnant of the crisis, which is a huge amount of debt, a lot of it dollar debt. Now, that's going to be perfectly manageable, in my view, in the developed countries, but it will be much more problematic in the emerging countries. So we emerge now strongly, but very unequally. And perhaps it's a very kind of thought. Of course, the crisis has generated a lot of ill will, political instability, anger, and that has certainly emerged and will affect the shape of relations in future.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think for a very timely, broad analysis of this global pandemic situation, and I think you're right. You know, we will see the recovery, but it won't be a linear, smooth one. You could be zigzag and ups and downs. We're still seeing things happening in India, and we don't know what's next. Maybe Africa, or there could be more second or third wave of that, and also the Chinese President Xi has actually last year pledged $2 billion to the developing countries and WHO to fight. I'm glad to see President Biden pledged $2 billion also at the G7 summit, and also that recently President Biden announced that he's giving up this patent for the pharmaceutical company on the vaccine. So what do you think about that? You know, how we can quickly turn this around, and what are the measures we can take on that?
Well, I'm an agnostic on the value of giving up the patents. In this context, in the context of this crisis, I've been persuaded from the work I've done, but I must stress I'm an economist, not a chemist or a biological scientist, that in the case of pharmaceuticals of this kind, having a patent doesn't really tell you how to make the thing. I mean, these are very complicated things to make. And this is particularly true of the new and very exciting mRNA vaccines, which have been developed in Germany and in America. So just having the patents won't, you can have it, but it won't mean that suddenly people can produce billions and billions of doses. However, so I think that's a very interesting issue. It's a very emotive issue, but I don't think it affects the next 6 to 8 months or a year, possibly even longer. And so I think I will put that to one side, though it's a very interesting issue. It's quite clear that we have to ramp up production worldwide to something like 10 or 12 billion doses a year. And it is very likely that we will have to multiply vaccinate people. That is to say, because this disease, it is now clear, mutates very quickly. There are many variants now. So far, the vaccines seem to work, but nobody knows how long that will be the case. So it's likely we will have to give booster shots to the world, everybody, as it were. Now, that creates two problems. We have to ramp up production. It is happening, and we will get to that sort of production level probably by the end of the beginning of next year. But it'll take at least a year or so before we do. And then the crucial question is, can we actually organize the distribution and actual vaccination of pretty well everybody in the world? because that's how we want to control this. You know, friends of mine have pointed out, no one's going to be really safe until the disease is completely under control. Otherwise, the mutations will come back to China, to Britain, wherever. So we have a big challenge ahead of us in terms of production and distribution of vaccine, and lots of vaccine hesitant people. But the progress we made in this regard is, to my mind, also quite unbelievable. You know, Chinese vaccines, Russian vaccines, Western vaccines. We have the capacity, without a doubt, if we want, to vaccinate the world. And the crucial thing is that the major countries which have the capacity to cooperate to make sure that it actually happens.
Absolutely, I agree. We have to collaborate. We have to really work together. If we're going to, vaccine the world and, reach poor countries together, I think those countries who already have advanced technology on vaccine, absolutely, we need to work even harder and a more coordinated approach to do that. So Martin, you are a glue on globalization. I mean, you published Why Globalization Works in 2004. That is already 16 years ago. And one of the things, I think, for the last 100 years, what has really unprecedented is the globalization trend and the practice and development. And that has really generated an enormous prosperity for our time, but also has now brought us the unprecedented challenge as well, as we set out at the beginning. So now with this complication of vaccine and also this pandemic also going on in the world, and a vaccine shortage, also that countries now seems to get more hijacked by populism and nationalism. And anyway, probably in the world now, it's a trendy thing to do that. Countries start, we already have a closed borders basically for the travel, and but also economy-wise, that is also happening, and also there's a lot of downgrade of each other, and then maybe going on across the world, and all kind of geopolitical things. So what do you see is the future of the globalization? Can we continue the globalization, or how we can really make a good adjustment of that, and also maybe have more inclusive globalization, as you've been often writing that on your column?
So another very big question. So it'll take a few minutes to answer as the last one. When I analyzed globalization in the book that you referred to, which was published also in China, as you rightly say, I think it was published in 2004. So it's nearly 20 years ago. And it was a defense of globalization. At that time, there were a lot of critics in the West. You might remember the WTO ministerial meeting in Seattle. It was a very famous event. I think in either 99 or 2000, you could correct me. And so it was a defense of globalization. It was basically arguing, these people were saying globalization is very bad for developing countries. It's exploitative and we should stop it. It wasn't about the developed countries so much. And I said, well, actually, the evidence is very clear. It's very good for developing countries. And China, of course, was a foremost example. China's incredible growth, then about 20 years, a little over 20 years, and subsequent growth clearly couldn't have happened without what you refer to in China as reform and opening up. Now, when I wrote this book, I said there are two drivers, crudely. There's technology and there's policy. They do interact a bit. In the long run, technology is influenced by policy. But in the medium run, and I mean the long run, centuries, or at least many decades, it's technology and policy. So let's look at where we are on technology and where we are on policy. Technology is the underlying potential given technological realities. And policy is, well, all the things you talk about, what governments do. On technology, I think one bit of globalization has been, to a substantial extent, exhausted. Naturally, it's not a policy thing, and one is just beginning. So the bit that is naturally exhausted is the unbundling of supply chains in goods across the world. That's been going on now for quite a long time. We had pretty clear evidence that by 10, 12 years ago, after the financial crisis, this was slowing. And I think the reason it was slowing was that an enormous part of the opportunities to unbundle physical supply chains had already been exploited. Some of the supply chains which had been unbundled with China as part of it were actually moving into China. So they were becoming Chinese supply chains. And in addition, the enormous cost advantages that particularly China, to a lesser degree Vietnam, had in the 80s and 90s were diminishing because, wonderful thing, wages were going up. So the result was that a completely natural slowing of the unbundling of physical supply chains occurred. And that won't accelerate until there's some huge new technological improvement. Our potential through transport links and links like the internet, telecommunications links, are not being transformed, with one exception I'll come to in a moment, in this regard. To give you an example, aeroplanes move basically about as fast now as they did 40 years ago. We've got huge container ships, but they're probably now about as big as they're ever going to get. Just look what just happened in the Suez Canal. So basically, the container which is put on the container ships is a great invention, but it's now 70 years old, roughly. So technologically, I think the unbundling of and movement of supply chains and the movement of goods may well have reached a natural plateau relative to our economy. It might continue a bit, but there's another completely different potential, which is what I think of as virtual globalization, or the globalization of ideas broadly defined. What we're doing now, what we have discovered in this crisis, is that it's actually possible to operate highly interactively, really highly interactively, without being in the same place. And it's obvious to me that that will generate huge potential for interaction among human beings, economic interaction, cultural interaction, interaction in terms of ideas. And here the relevant divisions are linguistic more than anything else. And even that, with the advances of AI, is going to diminish. I'm sure we will soon be in a world in which, when we talk like this, not with you, of course, I will talk in English and someone in China will speak in Mandarin, and I will hear this translated perfectly by AI, and the Chinese person will hear it perfectly translated by AI, and we'll have a conversation. That may not be this decade, it may be the decade after, but I think this will happen. So I think the virtual globalization has tremendous potential. And I think it's a wonderfully good thing, and it will create great difficulties because it will be very difficult to isolate yourself from the world intellectually and culturally. Now, I'm in favor of this, but it will create some challenges, pretty obviously. Now, then there's the policy. Now, here it's pretty clear. We have become more suspicious of one another. And that's partly because of divergent political developments. I'm not going to talk about China, but I think it's pretty clear. And in the West, clearly our societies have become more divided. That was happening before the financial crisis, but the financial crisis and now the pandemic has made that even bigger. It's made people more suspicious of one another, and politics more populist and more deeply divided. And when people really don't like one another in a country, this is age old. The one thing they can often agree on is that they dislike foreigners even more. So, I'm afraid xenophobia And this is, we're human. We are all the same. Xenophobia brings people together. That can be true, I would suggest, even in China, and certainly big time in the West. And that's happening. So politicians say, it's nothing to do with what's going on in our country. It's all the fault, let's say, Mr. Trump, it's all the fault of the Chinese. And people will listen to this. And we see this happening, not to the same degree in Europe, but it's happening. And then, of course, so that's the first thing. Then, of course, we are in the midst, objectively, of a massive power shift. And let's be completely realistic about it. The Europeans and their colonial offshoot, the US is a colonial offshoot of Europe, let's be clear, a very old one, they've been used to running the world for hundreds of years, and they don't like it changing, and they don't know what to do about it. And I think it's also true that China has not anyway worked out what it wants to do about its new position. And this is creating tremendous political tension. How do we run the world when we no longer run it, as it were? And that's creating more ill will. And people, then that leads, this combination leads to a desire to protect yourself, to make yourself more secure by reducing your reliance on one another, by making sure that you remain a world leader in technologies, which is itself, I think, quite understandable. And all that is getting in the way from a policy point of view of globalization. And you saw that in the trade war that Mr. Trump launched against China, which hasn't gone away, as you know. You can see that in friction over international relations, suspicion of one another, which comes out in rhetoric, I think on both sides, particularly, of course, in the US. And that affects globalization, because companies then say, quite naturally, okay, we're an American company, you're running an American company. Well, my government looks as though it really doesn't want me to be involved in China. And if I have to choose, well, I'm an American company. I've got to do what my government wants. If I am seen as sort of a bit of a traitor to my country by providing technology in China and using technology in China, I could get in terrible trouble. So these businesses start saying we should go home. And then they all have lots of friction, which is quite normal. There is friction between companies and governments. And they say, well, maybe it's not worthwhile. And the future of globalization is uncertain. I better go home. And that's happening, quite clearly happening. And that happens even if no policy is there. So the technology opportunities, I think, have gone in the way I've suggested, or going in the way I've suggested. And the policy is reinforcing this. So the globalization of goods and of supply chains is, I think, going to go very significantly into reverse, creating regional supply chains, more obviously. Chinese dominated run region, Western run region, how this will work out is very messy. And then we have this overlay of the future of what I call virtual globalization, which is reinforced by the greatest technological development of our era, which is obviously, apart from vaccines, apart from biochemical, biology, is artificial intelligence. So it's a very complex, very difficult and uncertain picture. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry it took so long, but it's a very big question.
It's a good to review that, to really have a sober mind to look at what's happened and to reflect that. I mean, you often has a lot of statistics, charts, and facts. So you've been really catching the trend quite accurate. What I think now, globalization has been going on for several decades intensively, probably last 100 years, as you said, when American overtake Europe, UK, and now dominate that for 100, some years probably. But now it seems that the more globalization we're going on, the more we intertwine, and we're not build up trust. The more we currently is on the contrary, we seems to be more destructive of each other. One of the things, I mean, you're very interested in the new book that you are coming up, A Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, where I think capitalism has been been pervaded in the last several hundred years now, and then at its peak probably already. And but it does seems to have a problem now. For example, you have I saw a chart you have done, where, for example, 1% of wealthy in Wall Street or in other countries, top percentage, the mass wealth is really equal to the huge population combined. And but then probably China has become a scapegoat for that, because we see multinational has been operating worldwide. And I saw another chart you have is that they've been, a lot of them has their a lot of profit they had, but not really benefit the host country or the home country, whereas putting the tax happen. Where that's really all those populism comes from. And then China again has been very centered on that. They take a lot of blame for that. So is that global governance is falling behind global practice? And should we have, I mean, recently I noticed President Biden comes up now say, oh, look, we're going to increase the lowest wage of the workers, greatly increase that. And also he proposed a flat tax a global flat tax on that. And EU and the US have this digital tax issue. So are we doing some adjustment that so that everybody's fair share? Multinational is doing its great job, rather than China is taking all the blame, and then politician has been self-fulfilling prophecy, because the populism needs to be carry the vote, and then it's good bashing China for getting elected. So what do you think about that? This kind of a dilemma that we are in. Whereas even during the pandemic crisis, I mean the most wealthy 1% in the US see the value has gone up even during the pandemic. Wall Street stock market has all-time high. So, but that is really not benefit trickling down, and then because of the globalization, it benefited. Of course, China benefited too, but the thing is that we should have a more equal, more inclusive globalization, particularly for those countries, for those masses at their own country, at the Western developed countries. And so something can be done in that area. You are the expert. Maybe what's your take on that?
Well, I'm writing a book on this. It's it's clearly going to be about 150,000 words in English of text. So this is a very large book of this kind, of which I am frightened about. And I feel that I've only touched the surface. The questions you pose are very deep ones. Let's start with sort of the inequality issue. The statistics, such as they are, suggest that there's pretty high level of inequality in China too. But the big difference, of course, is pretty clear, given the immense rate of growth in China, that, and I've seen some fairly detailed statistics done on this, that everybody in China pretty well has benefited substantially from growth in the last 30 years.
Also lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty.
Exactly. So 90%, 95% of the population has benefited enormously. So rising inequality matters less. Now, in the West, and particularly in America, the rising inequality has coincided, and this is controversial and complex, and I won't be able to go into all the statistics, but basically with pretty flat real income growth for a very large part of the population, and particularly the bottom half. And the reason for that is, you've got rising inequality of wealth and income. Income is, in my view, more important than wealth, but I won't have time to go into that. When overall productivity growth has been fairly slow. In China, productivity growth has been shooting ahead at 6, 7, 8% a year for decades, until relatively recently, when obviously it slowed since 2012. But in the West, it's been much slower. And it's been much slower for two main reasons. Well, three. One, we don't fully know. Why has productivity growth been relatively slow in America, in the West, in the last 40, 50 years? Very big question, which I won't have time to go into, but we'll put that to one side. But the other reasons clearly are these are already relatively advanced countries, so they can't gain much from importing new technology from elsewhere. They have to develop it in themselves. And I'm one of the people who believe that the new technologies we've been developing, given the structure of our economy, which I can't discuss in detail, but basically the domination over time, the increasing domination of personal services, the sorts of services that you can't easily automate in our economies, it's been very difficult to increase productivity. I think that, by the way, in the next 20 years, China will begin to suffer from the same problem. As industry becomes a diminishing force in China, and industry is always the sector, the big sector where productivity growth is fastest, you then end up with lots of other activities, which is much more like hospitals and schools and looking after old people, looking after where it's really hard to raise productivity. So you end up with an economy with huge service sector, a lot of it quite stagnant productivity. That may change in future, but that's where we are now. So productivity growth has been slow. Inequality is rising. Logically, that means a very large proportion of the population haven't had improving incomes, and that makes them very angry. And in societies with very diverse populations, this has created also very clear inter-ethnic friction. And that has allowed politicians to play on essentially an ethnic cultural war as part of their political strategy. And that is what I think of as blaming the other internally and also externally, because the other that you can blame are foreigners. So the characteristic of right-wing populism, which has become so powerful, is that you blame domestic others and foreign others, if I may use those phrases, for what's gone wrong. And you can see this very strikingly. Of course, that's what Donald Trump represented, and what the Republicans now represent. And you can see similar things, though not to the same degree, in Europe, in Britain and in European countries, in Italy and France, much less in Germany, but it's there. This is there. Very important. This, however, then has a second huge consequence: the return of nationalism. But here I would like to suggest there is a fundamental moral underpinning of this. So here we've got to get to the really deep conceptual fact, which is related to your question. The capitalist economy tends to be a global economy. It was true in the 19th century. Karl Marx wrote very well on this. I have a long quotation from Karl Marx in my book, very good, on the mid-19th century capitalist economy. And the reason for this is very simple. If you're a capitalist, you're in the market, there are opportunities globally, huge opportunities. That's why Chinese entrepreneurs have gone global and American entrepreneurs went global and all the rest of it. So the world economy, the world capitalist economy is naturally cosmopolitan. That was Marx's great insight. I mean, this is a cosmopolitan system, which in many ways is a good thing. And it's an effective system for developing growth. The market orientation of the Chinese economy has been very successful, to give one important example that Deng Xiaoping introduced. Now, but as the economy becomes more global, national control over the economy shrinks inevitably, because the economy is more global. It's not in your hot control in the way it used to be. And government is not global. Government is national. Whatever the political system, and they're very divergent, government is national. International government rests on the cooperation, but essentially the voluntary cooperation of national governments, which have domestic legitimacy and domestic accountability, be it democratic or not. I mean, clearly, it's no question the Communist Party of China feels accountable to the Chinese people, quite rightly. That's their job, right? So that then creates a permanent friction in a globalizing system between the logic of the economy, which is global and not really deeply anchored nationally, but to some extent it is, of course, and the logic of politics, which is national, and accountability is national. And in a democracy, this is reflected in the election of people to power who are really running against the global capitalists. What's interesting about American politics is that the right and the left are both now running against the global capitalists. Very extraordinary. Now, in this situation, of course, maintaining the international cooperation among governments needed to create the amount of global order, global governance, global rules in trade, in finance, in dealing with climate, whatever it may be. That's very difficult because all the political forces upon them are national and are forcing them to pay most attention to their domestic citizens. And so it takes very wise statecraft, very disciplined, to say to people, yeah, we are looking after you. That's what we are trying to do. But cooperating globally is the best way for us to do this. We can adjust the way we cooperate globally, but actually we can't close off our economies. That will impoverish us. By agreeing to do things globally, we will actually be able to do better for you here at home. Now, that is the line I would take, of course, but it's not a line that it's easy to sell. It's very sophisticated and rather complex, and it looks as though you're abandoning national sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So, particularly when people are frightened and angry, when there are these huge power shifts, the result is it's very difficult to make that sort of sophisticated argument that I've just made, that the best way to achieve domestic aims is through international economic integration and cooperation. That's where we are. Now, I think Biden very clearly understands this better than Trump. Nobody understood it less than Trump. Really, almost impossible to do this. But even he knows he has to satisfy domestic constituencies that have been losers. Now, I think mostly they have lost, not entirely, but it's not, trade has not been a big factor. I think mostly they've lost, as you've implied, because of domestic political changes, failure to pay taxes, failure to get corporations to pay taxes. The immensely striking thing is that the richest people in America have the lowest tax rate. That's the reality. They have the lowest tax rate. And the way he has to deal with that is to make sure they pay taxes. And to do that, he has to deepen cooperation, which is what he's trying to do on corporation tax and things like that. So the route through better domestic policy goes through better global policy. And this is a very sophisticated game, which is quite difficult to sell. And in terms of relations with China as a superpower, with a very different political system, it's particularly difficult to sell. So one of the things that I think is happening with what you might broadly describe the somewhat populist left in the West is it's becoming alliance oriented, not global. You can say it's Western alliance oriented. So it's fragmenting the world, but not into countries, but into alliance systems, which is also very dangerous, by the way. But that's where it seems to go. It's a halfway house between purely national economic sovereignty and the globalization. That seems to me the way it is now going. And obviously, perfectly understandably, China, meanwhile, which is to establish itself as an advanced technology power by developing enormous strength in the technologies that the West has historically dominated. And Westerners, quite a lot of Westerners, regard this as threatening. So it has become very, very difficult to balance national politics with global cooperation, economic and security politics. And that's where we are. That's where we are now. And I don't know what Graham Allison said to you, but the most obvious period, which had some echoes of this, is the period when the West dominated, of course, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that led to a complete breakdown of the world system.
Yeah, no, thank you, Martin. I think you're right. We analyze, of course, this in depth on that. The global governance falling behind global practice. You wrote in your book, Crisis of a Democratic Capitalism, which you said capitalism is global and that democracy is local. That's a very good summary of that. So if we have this kind of a contradictory end on both sides, and then so capitalism is really have a free, wide, running around the world and then benefit all the top elite. Whereas democracy is local, they felt they were really suffered or didn't have an equal opportunity. Then they are constantly self-generating all those local politicians that bashing globalization and bashing global capitalism in a global. So I think you're absolutely right. So the solution for that is, first of all, I think the international cooperation still needs to be enhanced, strengthened, and being the pandemic fighting or climate change, let's build up some trust. Otherwise, we're going to be driven far apart by these ideological and value differences, so-called, right? And you actually said very well. I mean, you remember I read somewhere that you first came to China in 1993. You stayed in Shanghai Peace Hotel. Across the river, you see the Pudong, and then you see how that has gradually changed in the last several decades. So China actually, we just had the population census data coming out of yesterday, and then you see China has 1.1 billion people now, still going a little bit, but the amount of population who has a college education is almost 220 million. That's enormous, the largest well-trained population in the world now, and then the younger population between below the 14 years old is still quite a lot, 70%. And then of course one of the problems is that the age before 60 is getting even higher, but the mean age is about 38 something, which is still relevant, younger than many Western countries. So the things now, I think is the value now, where we have to see the difference. So China, I was talking to Graham Allison or Joseph Nye or Thomas Friedman. No one agreed on the Cold War. Said, we shouldn't fight the Cold War. We are already in it's a bad energy, and we are already intertwined. The problem I think now. Why is the global governance falling behind? Local politics is strong and the global politics. The other thing is that, of course, do we recognize a peaceful rise in China? I mean, that is a thing that nobody will deny if they come to China. The transformation going on is beyond recognition in the last 4 decades since Deng Xiaoping opened up. And, now China is contributed 1/3 of a global GDP growth. It's the largest trading nation with 130 countries. It's actually, it's the top category of a producer of over 200 products classified by the United Nations. And of course, second largest donor to the UN system. And, going on. And so China doesn't export famine or refugees and not even ideology, as you pointed out some time ago. So why can't, the world have a different view on China? And maybe, let's have a peaceful competition, like let's do Olympic stuff, I mean, rather than really thinking this is something, this model, our model is the best. If China doesn't converge, then let's really place them as a rivalry number one. There could be some rivalry, as Joseph and I, both Joseph and I and Graham Allison said, let's cooperative rivalry or rivalry partner, using their words. So can we really reach that kind of trend in the future, rather than we are self-reinforcing each other, and I mean, Blinken said, let's go up, not compare going down, let's compare going up. So can we do something going up? And how would you advise that? You know, I mean, from your assessment.
Okay, so this is such a huge question. I think the one of the questions that I've been thinking about is, let us suppose China were had a political system like ours. Would we feel differently about it? It's a very interesting question, because it's quite possible that the answer is no. Mm-hmm. That is to say, though I don't think it is fully no, that simply such an enormous shift in the balance of global power, which you've described very well, creates uncertainty and fear everywhere else. And that's what the Thucydides trap is about. And that would happen even if there were absolutely no ideological elements in it at all. But of course there are, and there's also history. So I've always assumed that some substantial degree of friction was inevitable. And we just have to accept that. We do have nationally based global politics. The question, second, are there any analogies from the past that help us to think about this? I agree with you completely. The Cold War is a hopeless analogy, because it was a pure ideological competition. We had almost no economic relations between the West and the Soviet Union. They were almost completely independent entities. And the Soviet Union was not really at any stage, it was a military rival, no question, but not an economic one. So this is not a useful model. We are enormously economically integrated with China. China is a huge economic power, will become a bigger one. And we also share a world which we now see we have to look after together. So that makes managed cooperation simply the only way we can possibly do this. Of course, the one thing we do share with the Cold War period, which it must be evident, that war is unthinkable. War has been unthinkable since the invention of the nuclear weapon. So it just has to be put outside any thought, the possibility of actual war between superpowers. Now, so how does cooperation work? I think you have to break down the elements in it in a pragmatic way. There are the global commons, and they have to be separated. They can't all be dealt with together, and they must be dealt with pragmatically. The global commons, climate, the oceans, the protection of species, there are big issues here in which China will be centrally involved and will have to do a lot. And I think China will have to do a lot more than it's now planning in all these areas. And that will be quite tough for China as well as for us, of course. So that's a huge challenge, but that is in China's interest too. So I think there's hope. Then there are managing security relations in such a way that they're stable. So everybody understands what their fundamental interests are and manages them without friction. It's absolutely crucial, and I don't think it's happening enough. Then there's economics. And here, I believe the West has legitimate concerns with Chinese behavior. And I'm sure China has legitimate concerns with Western behavior. My own view is, one, both sides need to define what they regard as their absolutely core security interests in technology, which are legitimate. And they have to say, these sectors are ones we are going to make sure are nationally independent. And we will agree that, and that will have impacts for trade, and we'll just accept that. It's pretty clear that's going to happen. There are core technologies both sides want to control for their own sake. Fine. Everything else should be conducted according to normal rules of trade, but they have to be reciprocal and equal. I think the way Trump went around about this was mad, but there is a case for a profound negotiation between China and major powers on a new trade order, a new trade system with new rules which are more legitimate and work better. Some of them will be tighter and some of them will be looser. They will be different. I think that is now required. We can't go on as we've been and pretend the WTO system and the 2001 China accession is still the last word on this relationship. So that has to be done. And then we have immensely important areas where we need to cooperate, like health, like health, development, debt, which is a big problem. China is a big creditor. We're big creditors, where there just has to be active day-to-day cooperation, and that will require considerable changes in international economic and organizations. It's a tremendous agenda. And it won't do, I think, anymore just to go back to where we were 15 years ago. We have to think of it forward. And that will require immensely imaginative statescraft in the West and in China. And that's the agenda.
Yes, great. Yeah, I think that you gave a lot of deep thinking on that as well. I was always wondering, I mean, China, probably the rise of China, peaceful rise of China is a blessing to the world. What I think is that, maybe when we look at the development of the last 100 years or 50 years of the globalization and development, maybe we're seeing the technology development has hugely transformed the international business and environment. We see the modern, the connectivity has really, also the social media, all the things has really, beyond the recognition changed the world. So we cannot use the old way of measurement. It looks like we're still using the 20th century measurement to the 21st century reality. Particularly with China. For example, China now with 5,000 years history, basically it's restored its probably rightful place in history, and also it has its own logic. They respect seniority. There's always a strong central government due to the large irrigation and in a huge population and things like that. And China also have some kind of a collectivism where they have showed a great effectiveness during the pandemic fighting, sacrifice a little bit of human freedom on that. But also you can see also that we have the other thing is we saw that in the culture of Oriental, East Asian culture, even Japan is always ruled by one party. I mean, briefly by social Democrat, but largely ruled by peoples. And then Singapore. I mean, you look at those East Asian culture as well. So I'm thinking, Chinese system it works for China very well and lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Where Larry Summers said something compatible to the industrial revolution of the British Empire, in the last several hundred years. So it's really how we can get that accepted. Also, Chinese economy now is a hybrid. You had a right balance of private sector 60%. You have another 10-50% multinational. Have another 20% maybe SOE, 10-50%, and then land is also owned by the public and private. So it's really easy to do infrastructure, do all those. So those are maybe, and also the government play a bigger role in terms of doing infrastructure, doing all those 1 billion smartphone users. China has already 1.4 billion, 1.3 billion people covered as some kind of Medicare, the largest Medicare coverage in the world. 1 billion has been covered by the social security of some sort. So what went wrong? I mean, can we have a new system that compatible or comparable? It's not the Fukuyama sounds the end of history. I mean, can we have I've been using the Joseph Nye's words, maybe 2035, we'll see people get gradually accept to that. Or maybe we see the better relation then. So this is a very agonizing process. How China can do better, I mean, to explain China better to the world. I mean, also the narratives that we hope to shape in and maybe to have a better understanding communication. I mean, China is living in a world now. We are living in a world of democracy as well. I mean, the largest opposition party is the United States, probably EU as well. China is watched by thousands of media, social networks. The China's top leaders is constantly read digest from around the world. They're constantly changing that. And China has this kind of a consultative democracy. All the elites get together. The 14th five-year plan had 1 million comments and the revision, the suggestions throughout the country. So it's kind of a different, democratic process. Can this kind of new system be accepted or peacefully coexisted with the rest of the world, rather than we have to bash? So one European leader once said, China lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Just imagine 10% of that become refugee. I mean, 2 million of the Middle East refugees from Syria has already, distorted the whole Europe, but de-globalization and the Brexit. If 10% of Chinese poverty people didn't get out of poverty, become a refugee flooded the world, we may have an even worse situation now. So can we really live with a peaceful China? And how can China do better to do that?
God, that's an enormous set of questions. So there are two, I could respond to this in two different ways. One, which is my personal views on China, its likely evolution and its system. And the other is to look at this, as it were, as a human being from Mars, which obviously I'm not, and to say, well, how might you be able to resolve this? As I've been implying, an enormous amount of this, at least 50%, possibly 2/3, is just about relative power. And power matters to people. Surely I don't have to explain that to a Chinese person. The Chinese empire was a power structure. It always has been. And so we have, I think perfectly from the Chinese point of view, completely legitimate and appropriate restoration of normal power relations from your point of view. Perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable. But from the Western point of view, particularly from the US point of view, this is a transformation of power relations downwards. People don't like becoming relatively weaker because it constrains your freedom of action. That's what power means. Power is the ability to do what you like. Becoming relatively weaker means you can do less of what you would like, or it becomes costlier in some way. And people don't like that. That's what politics have always been about in all systems. The most basic, they're about power. So we are in the middle of a huge shift in relative power. And the people who are at the wrong end of this shift don't like it. And that's what the Thucydides trap is about. And this has nothing to, that's what I said. Would it let us suppose the Chinese system today were just like us? Obviously ridiculous, but would we still have these resentments? And the answer is yeah. We would have a lot of these resentments, as I said, at least 50%. So this wouldn't be resolved by any of the issues that you mentioned. If the explaining China to the world wouldn't resolve any of that, because the power shift is real. And the power shift is, of course, associated with the great success. Lifting 800 million people out of poverty is why China is now a huge power and will become more so. So there's the power thing. Power relations can only be managed. And power relations have to be managed through systems that generate trust. This is absolutely central. And systems develop trust by acting in ways on both sides that give confidence in one another. And a lot of things have happened on both sides which have undermined it. It's just a reality. I can go through the list. You know the list. That's just how it is. And these have been mistakes made by us and mistakes, in my view, made by China. Quite big ones. So that's the first side. Then there's the governance issue. And then I'll come to the economics one. China is historically, as you rightly say, a distinct civilization. It is in fact the heart of a distinct East Asian civilization, which is very old. And the countries you mentioned, Japan, Korea, obviously, Singapore for different reasons, are all part of that Chinese system of ideas. And they are very, very different from the Western tradition. And I could just talk about that for a long time because it's been a huge interest of mine. Most people don't know, but long before I became an economist, I spent years studying the ancient European, ancient Greek and ancient Latin. And so I know something about the history of Western culture. And I've always been very interested in Chinese philosophy and the differences, right? Also in Indian, by the way. So you have these very different civilizations. So it was always likely that China would become a very different sort of political system from anything in the West, and that it would never be a liberal democracy in our sense. It was perfectly clear that that was very, very unlikely to happen, which is not itself a problem, as long as you can do business with it, which means that it's predictable. The particular form it's taken in China is to a Western, and I've made this point, somewhat puzzling, because to us, communism is a Western philosophy and one we haven't accepted. So that's quite strange. But the core of it is clearly what you say, and we can understand that's fundamentally different. Because of that, China operates in ways that we find very difficult to accept and like on quite important issues. And the same is true for us, for Chinese people. You've emphasized, for instance, our indifference in many countries, particularly in US, to rising inequality without doing anything about it. Well, that sort of seems crazy, doesn't it? So we have to live with difference. We have to live with profound difference while managing the power relations. That's very tricky if things happen which either side regard as fundamentally unacceptable. But living with difference is the second huge challenge. And I don't think explaining yourselves would help much here. I don't think Westerners fundamentally misunderstand what China is. Some do, obviously lots do, but reasonably well-informed Westerners understand what China is. They just can't really accept that there is another way of being modern. It just doesn't fit in with the universalism, which is so characteristic of Western thinking. Westerners are universalists. This goes back a long way. I could go into that. The final point is we have all these economic relations. And as I've said, I think the way to resolve these is to separate out core security questions, because in a world of power, security matters, from everything else. And that's difficult. The border will change. And I think it can be done to some extent by mutual agreement. But we have to define what we regard as vital national interests and what we don't, and deal with them in the economic sphere. So my approach to this will be slightly different from yours. I don't think we'll ever, I think there's going to be a real problem in ever reaching a world in which everybody likes one another. But the truth is we live in our countries with people we don't like very much. That's quite normal. Problems of this kind have to be managed pragmatically. they're not going to be managed by everybody saying, well, actually, we really all like one another. It would help, as I once said, if we were invaded by people from Mars, but we're not going to be invaded by people from Mars. So we have a lot of interests in common, a lot of values that we do share, and we have to build on those to manage a very long-term future, which will be complicated. And certainly explaining each other to one another would be sensible. But accepting difference and managing it is what this is about. This will be more difficult for the West than for China. And in some areas, it will create very severe friction, but I think it's manageable. And that seems to me the mature way to handle this. Nobody's going to win. It's impossible for one side to win. So the only way to deal with this is to manage it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Martin. You have, quite objective analysis of the situation. I think that, your new book, Capital and Democracy, that capitalism is global and the democracy is local. Have we reached some kind of a stage that even democracy, the concept that has been originated 2,000 years ago by our Greek philosophers, maybe with the modern technology and the modern huge population, when the democracy concept was born, it was probably the whole world, probably less than 100 million people. Now it's 75 billion, 7.5 billion. Should we upgrade that notion? Because there could be a different format of that. One man, one vote maybe works in an individual center society, whereas this consultative democracy, meritocracy, like just imagine a government official in China, if he's going to be promoted a minister or governor, he has to do 2 years at the rural areas, and then has at the county level, at the municipality level, at the provincial level, at the government level, and finally at the Politburo, standing committee. There was many ranks, and there were 1,000 years of Mandarin system in China that has been selecting through that process. So and now just imagine there's 200 million, over 200 million college graduates in China now, accounting 12, 10%, 15% of the whole population. That's probably a new format. And again, technology. 1 billion smartphone user. Every day he's using smartphone voting. Where to buy, where to shop, where to go, what job to take, where to, which newspaper to read. They really have a lot of choice. And also probably the human rights concept has to be upgraded as well. I mean, look at this pandemic fight is a good example. People in the Western country doesn't want to be locked down and is violating their human right, whereas China accepted that. And then China is the most free country in the world in terms of the last May Day holiday, the boom of 700 million people travel around for the domestic tourism boom, unprecedented. So I'm just thinking of this technology democracy, this market democracy, and then all those things combined. Maybe China is experimenting with some new model with meritocracy and with all those kind of and also just imagine the synergy that China has with everywhere you go is a few hours now by speed train, high-speed train, and then 5G. There's about 1 million stations on 5G, 4 million 4G stations. It's such a highly artificial intelligence, the power of the world now. So if China is doing well, and then it's going to lift the world out of this. You're absolutely right. Compared with Mars, if we're attacked by Mars, we're all human beings. We should help each other. I was really surprised to see we are fighting pandemic, and big countries don't talk to each other. Big countries even not really is busy on the other front of a set of alliance against countries, not set of alliance against the virus. That's really very, very sad to see. So I'm just thinking how, on the other hand, of course, China needs to do better as well, explain itself, maybe more open more journalists to come, have more tourism, welcome more foreign students. China is willing to learn from other countries. China has, since China opened up, there's 7 million Chinese students study around the world. Probably less than 1 million foreign students come to China, So I think there's a lot of things that we could do better among each other. And but fundamentally, are we having some kind of a new running of the country, for example. I mean, we cannot, if China doesn't converge, since China joined WTO, if China doesn't converge, oh, you are not one of us, you are the other aliens. We're going to contain you, we're going to bash you. Can we avoid that kind of mentality?
Well, you've raised so many different issues, and I think the perfectly legitimate points from the Chinese point of view. Okay, I have the following sorts of reactions. First, there are genuine conflicts of interest. The South China Sea is a conflict of interest. You might say you have one point of view, we have another point of view. That's just a straight conflict of interest, has to be managed. Then there are conflicts of values, as you've said. Now, the way you present it seems to suggest that and it may be true, by the way, I have no idea, that in the end, we will converge, if we're sensible, on Chinese values, but we're not going to. The fundamental assumptions that underpin contemporary Western culture are very deeply rooted in our history. Probably not 5,000 years, but let's say 2,500. They're essentially a marriage of ancient Greek and Judeo-Christian. And the Jewish part of it goes back probably 3,500 years. These are not going to change. So our culture, for a whole host of reasons, is more individualistic, more law-based, less bureaucracy-based. And though we have converged on in very important ways, we develop bureaucracies in important ways in imitation of China. It's not an accident that we call our top bureaucrats in Britain Mandarins. That's what we call them. That's not an accident. Of course, our bureaucracies mostly originated actually with the church bureaucracy. The Catholic Church influence on Western history can never be exaggerated. So I don't want to go into all this. I can go on forever. But democracy has proved representative government, which is modern, by the way. It's a British invention. No, it's basically British invention. It's very different from the ancient world. But democracy has always proved very adaptable and flexible. We've been able to import bureaucracy into it, which is quite meritocratic. So we have a mixture of meritocratic, bureaucratic, and representative elements in our constitution with this enormous role for the law. It's a composite civilization, and it should not be simplified. And some of it is very close to China, and some of it's very, very different. It will evolve. It has always evolved. It has to evolve now because it's in terrible trouble. Just as 200 years ago, your old imperial system was in terrible trouble and had to collapse to create a new Chinese system. What you have in China today is clearly rooted in the Chinese past, but it's a new Chinese system. And that may well happen to us, but it will happen internally. It will happen as a result of internal, external pressures. And I think in the meantime, and the meantime is at least the next half century or so, we have to live with rather different assumptions about how things will work. And we will see who overall does better. And it seems to me, looking at it, that China does some things incredibly well, above all, anything that involves mass mobilization of resources. China's system is staggering. And there are things we do rather well in terms of ideas, in terms of creativity, in terms of flexibility. There are things we do well. And I think from the human point of view, it would be good if both civilizations function and develop and we learn from one another. I think historically, as I've already told you, we learned from China. We learned about government from China. This is largely forgotten. And of course, obviously, China's learned from the West in the last century, I would say. and certainly in the period of the communist rule. So, but we have to accept that we're going to remain different. Now, that creates really big interface problems in important areas, and they're not trivial ones. You mentioned human rights. Well, these are sort of core things for Westerners, and they are going to go on being core things. Maybe they shouldn't be, but they are. Where does human rights come from in the Western tradition? It comes on from the fundamental idea that every individual is a spark of God. Every individual matters to God, and they matter as individuals to God. You can't take God out of the West. We've tried quite hard, but it's still there in one form or the other. So you just have to accept that will go on. That individualism will go on. And human rights, that means a system which is based on the idea of collective rights and collective responsibilities like yours will interface badly. Then you want to innovate and develop technology to the highest possible degree. We don't want to be dependent entirely on Chinese technology. We think that will be rather concerning. I can understand that. So that means our governments are going to become more active. They're going to become more like yours. We're going to spend more money on building our own technologies and developing and protecting them. And that, in this respect, I think what Biden is doing, interestingly, I think Biden thinks that what he's doing is what the Chinese do, right? That's why he's spending all his money. So we're learning from you. An active state, spend lots of money. No, that's not new. The West has been there before. The American state basically created the railroad system and the highway system that linked it together. Then for 40 years, they forgot all about it. And now we're learning. This is important. We're becoming like you. So we'll learn from one another and we will remain different from one another, profoundly different. And there will be friction, lots of it, because you have attitudes to things that are happening, say in Hong Kong, whatever it might be, which we don't share. We cannot live in this world together if we expect everybody to agree. That it may be possible within a country, but it won't happen. And living with difference is possible as long as you realize what you share as human beings, and the planet, which is very fragile, and peace, which is very important to everybody. And as you said, last word, the one thing you get out of this crisis is Chinese government cares about the lives of Chinese people, and we care about the lives of our people. We did it rather badly, but we've learned we're not going to do this, make these mistakes again. We now understand what a pandemic is. We won't do those mistakes again. We will learn. And then we've got to learn to live with one another. That's the great task. And in the end, we will say, okay, these people are different from us, but we're still human. We can learn a lot from one another and we can share ideas as we've done today. And I've enjoyed it enormously. And I said, hope you have too.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. It's absolutely, I found this very enlightening and stimulating talking to you. You've been so wide, open-minded, and then you actually mentioned about, we can learn from each other. Absolutely, China is always, science and democracy in the May 4th movement about 100 years ago. China was learning from West all the time along. Opening up is largely open to the West. When China, Deng Xiaoping said in 1978, December, they had a third plan of the 11th Party Congress. And on January 1st, they established diplomatic ties with the US. So absolutely right. Our dialogue is really fascinating. We had about 1 million viewers. I mean, my staff showed me now watching us. And what I want to final maybe one or two questions is that your article, you recently wrote an article about China is wrong to think US facing inevitable decline, and which is widely read in China. I mean, you summarize well all the competitive strength of US, the best universities, venture capitals, and corporate multinationals are leading on that. So all those are great stuff. And probably, also one of the things I think US is doing very well, including Western countries too, is attracting global talent. I mean, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister, said China is picking talent from 1.3 billion people, whereas US is picking talent from 7 billion people. That's probably one of the core advantages that US has. So if US is doing well from 0 to 1, and China has this 1.41 biggest population in the world, biggest application scene that they can apply the technology. So US is doing well from 0 to 1, and China is doing well from 1 to 10, 1 to 100. Can we all display our competitive advantage that David Ricardo has said, let's do us better. China is also relatively still, the population dividend is still continue will for some year. I mean, also China is doing well on other things. I mean, according to the Global Innovation Index, China hosts the 17 of the top science technology cluster worldwide with Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Guangdong, Great Bay, and Beijing. And also China is actually now they have on the patent applications now, first time surpassed the US as the largest patent country in the intellectual property rights on that. And also China's universities is catching up. So what I'm thinking is that if we, relatively say, okay, everybody has its advantage and disadvantage. If US is doing well on the innovation, on the global, multinationals, and China is doing great on its market. You just imagine, it's already have 400 million middle class. In the next 10, 15 years, we may have 8 million middle class coming up. It's great for the world. I mean, let's all benefit from each other rather than we have to really, decouple or contain, or we have a different system. So can we really have a competitive advantage series still, which is a famous UK economist that has proposed that? Can we still practice that?
Well, we can't decouple, that's clear, and we mustn't decouple. That's clear from what I've argued. I think having deep economic relations is a good thing, both because it makes us more prosperous and because it gives a strong mutual interest in one another's fate. It also leads to exchanges of ideas, knowledge, and understanding. So all this is very, very important. But I also think, as I said, that the reality of the relations among states is always one of power. Kissinger, who after all is one of the great bridge individuals, always talks about the balance of power. And I think we are going to need to maintain a stable balance of power, because it's when it starts being destabilized that possibilities of conflict arise. That's what Graham is arguing. And the one aspect of power is obviously technological. So I do expect an ongoing technological rivalry. How that should work out is important. I don't want to get into the details of, do I think the Western attitude to Huawei made any sense? As far as I can see, it didn't. But it seems to me obvious that Western powers, above all the US, are going to try and maintain technological autonomy in certain areas which they regard as central to their security. That's normal and can be perfectly well managed within a world which is open in all other respects. I think there should be movement of people. I myself think it is, and this will no doubt be regarded as offensive, and I understand the sensitivities on China's side, but I think that I actually think in terms of information flows, we are going to have to tighten up on what is allowed on our internet, and I think you're going to have to loosen what is allowed on your internet, so we are more even in that regard. I mean, we obviously have allowed the internet to become a perfect media for the dissemination of lies, and this is unbelievably dangerous for our stability. I won't go back into the question of what democracy means now, because that would take half an hour. I've written a book on it. But anyway, but I think at the same time that the level of censorship in your system has to decline. The openness to the world in terms of knowing what's going on. Journalism is very, very important. That has to be maintained on both sides. We need to be even if you don't like it, allowed to report. And the same applies, of course, to Chinese journalists in the West. We need to be open to one another in that fundamental respect. So I believe that the rivalry which Joe and Graham talked about, and it is a rivalry, we have to be realistic, can be perfectly well managed without, if you like, cooperative rivalry in such a way that everybody benefits. But the situation is not what it was 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And the other side of this is China is now a superpower and a rising one. And China will have to say to itself, okay, what sort of world do we want? How do we feel about the institutions of the world order? How do we interact with them? How do we want to shape them? How can we do that in ways that give other powers a sense of security and to fit in with our system? Now, this is a completely new challenge. I've made this point many times. The challenge for the West is obvious. We discussed this. There's also a huge challenge for China in this sense. Historically, China was the largest for at least a large part of the last 2,000 years. China was the biggest and richest place in the world. But it was because of the technology of the time, it was largely isolated from the rest of the world. And its neighbors were much, much smaller. So this is the first time in Chinese history that China is a great power within the world as a whole. And the world is a biggish place. China has 1.4 billion people, as you rightly say, but the world has about 8. And it has other powers and other interests. So China, for the first time in its history, is a great power, fully restored, operating within a global system that it cannot dominate. And the same, by the way, is true of the West and the US. They don't understand this yet. The West has been so used to dominating, it find it almost impossible to get used to the idea it can't anymore. But I think the same problem in a different way arises with China. So there is a way in which China has to think through, okay, we did incredibly well and rose to this immense stature in a world whose institutions were Western largely, and in which the West thought it was dominant. That period is over, and we don't accept that anymore. Fine, no problem with that. But, okay, how do we fit into this world? We are different. We have different political systems and orders. Everyone is different. We're all different. So how do we make a reasonable order from our point of view in this? Do we wish to merely to maintain the autonomy of the Chinese state? Do we want to create a large number of tribute states around us? How do we relate to the other great powers? What is a sensible way of doing this? I think there's a lot of thinking beyond the peaceful rise. The peaceful rise has happened. The rise has happened. Of course, China's a long way to go. It's still relatively poor. It's a lot of development. But China, as you pointed out, is now a leading power. By the way, the point about the patents was in my article. I made that point in the article. China is clearly a major power. I was merely trying to point out that the US is not yet finished. That's all. So I think there's a big challenge for China too, in working out, well, where does China fit into this world? How does it want the world to be ordered? So to take one specific example, we've gone through many, the World Trade Organization. It's pretty obvious that the World Trade Organization as it is now doesn't really work. We haven't had a successful global negotiation since 1995. Not really, except the Chinese accession. The WTO is not able to handle the US-China conflict. That's obvious. That's why they went out of it. Does China want a new system? What would it look like? I don't know. Um, does China think it will be okay if the system collapses? Probably not. I don't know. So I've been giving speeches in China every time I would come to the China Development Forum. I think the first speech I ever gave there was in 2010. And I said, what is your Chinese view as leader of the world trading system? What is China's view on the future of the trading system? I asked. And I think that's a question that is still no answer. By the way, I think the same is true on the monetary system, though your previous PBOC governor talked about that. So I want China to be a leader. I want China to come forward with its ideas on how this new world is to run. I think that will be very challenging. It won't be the way it was in 2005. That's over. But we need, I agree with you completely, to have a working relations, cooperative relations, despite immense differences and frictions which will never go, differences on views on human rights and things like this. They're not going to go. And I would be very grateful for strong Chinese positions in the world on how you want to take this forward. You hear a lot from the US because it's used to this, but you don't hear much from China, except the idea, which I understand, is things were fine as the way they were. Why don't we keep them that way? From your point of view, that's absolutely right. They were, but we're not going to go back. So I think China is at a point in which, and this is a big point I've been making, that we want more leadership from China. And we will probably disagree violently, but we'll disagree about real things. And that's fine. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that, as long as it's peaceful and it's ultimately aimed at managing relations.
Great, absolutely. I think that you have this expectation that China should be more actively on the international scene. I agree with you. I think China should, and of course, there's the international order is really made by U.S.-led and Bretton Woods system and all English speaking and international continental law or common law system. So China is actually a latecomer for that. So it takes time, but I agree. China should do more. Now the newly appointed WTO DJ announced that there are 4 deputy WTO Director General has been appointed, and one of them is from China, former Vice Minister from Commerce. He will be the new DJ Zhang Xiangchen, Vice Minister Zhang Xiangchen. Now is the new Deputy Director General of WTO. So I agree. We need to learn from Western countries how to be more active internationally. That's actually naturally connected to some of the questions we collected before our event. We announced you're coming, and there's quite a number of questions posed to you. And one of them is about this international order. This question is from Hongxin News, saying that just like the magazine of a Politico said in 2020, the old world order is already dead or gone. Maybe countries lose their trust because of each other, between each other. And there's also a backlash against globalization and the future international economic order. So I actually personally, I think also, this question is that relevant is that, for example, China has one experiment, which I think done very well, is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. China has actually, taken initiative, and 103 countries, 4 countries participate. The largest multilateral successful company China has, and India is the largest recipient of the AIIB loans. I know that President Biden also now proposed 2.3 trillion on the infrastructure. So infrastructure could be one of the biggest low-hanging fruit for the world to have in the next several decades. And China has already developed capacity and financially, technologically, coupled with multinational legal advice and consultants from engineering consultants and from West countries. Maybe we could work together. Can we have a global infrastructure investment bank rather than, upgrade that? So we can, US and China, EU, we can create a large pie and work together. So for the New Bretton Woods movement, also international climate change could be something to glue us together, and the pandemic fighting. And so we need to find more common tasks or challenges that work together as a human being and mankind. So what do you think about that on the new global order, how we can really shape a new...
I think that's, I think having common tasks, shared tasks is very important. And I think that one of the best ways of managing this relationship is to these tasks. And you've mentioned some very, very important ones. I think the AIIB is a great success. It's been with an exceptional governance system. Creating institutions like that is excellent. In each of these areas that you mentioned, climate, infrastructure, pandemic, so forth, there are clearly possibilities, very important possibilities. There are also some really pretty big problems in all these areas, perhaps because we haven't talked enough to one another. On the infrastructure side, for example, obviously the core of this at the moment is the BRI. There's been very little Western involvement in this, and there's a lot of Western suspicion. Suspicion about its geopolitical purpose, and suspicion about the terms of the debts and the debt problems that have arisen out of it. And by the way, let me make clear, I'm not blaming China on this. I'm just saying this is the fact. The BRI could be seen as a power play by China, or as a step by China to participate in the global future by using its enormous strengths. And I think the way that those doubts can be resolved is by opening up to discussion the way the BRI works. I think there are some big issues there. By the way, there's some objectively big issues. It's clearly debt problems that have arisen. And that leads to a second question, which has become a very big one, and I've been involved in discussions in the last couple of years, 3 years, which is China is a very important creditor in the world now, which is great success. And of course, we're now going to move into a world in which we're going to have a lot of bad debt. There's going to be a lot of bad debt after the pandemic. So one of the questions is, how are we going to go negotiate all this? How is bad debt going to be negotiated? Let's suppose you've got a country that owes a lot to the Bretton Woods institutions, a lot to Western private interests, a lot to Western governments, and they owe a lot to Chinese companies and the Chinese government. In this situation, negotiating debt is virtually impossible because nobody will want to reduce their debt, because they will say, this is it, I'm going to pay the price, and the other creditors will get their money back. That's not fair. And historically, those situations have always made it impossible to renegotiate debt at all, because nobody wants to go first. So we are going to have to create or recreate or create new, expand debt forum for all major debtors and creditors, including China. China will obviously want a powerful voice in this. But if you think about the Paris Club, you think of the future, which I believe, sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, which I think we need, a global one. That's going to be a very, very big area where concrete cooperation is going to require multilateralism. Trade we've discussed, and I hope that the new Deputy Director General of the WTO can put forward ideas on how this system can evolve. It's going to be a very big challenge now, I think, on how to do it. I wish the new Director General, whom I know well, every success. But again, in all these areas, it's partly China comes forward with a global view, and the West has to accept China as a legitimate partner. At the moment, I think neither is happening. These are completely separate discussions, and that makes it much more difficult to managing things. Now, it's obvious again that if you look at the pandemic, the WHO is too weak. It needs to be a much stronger global institution. It lost a lot of legitimacy in early period in the West, partly because of our mistakes and partly because of theirs. But it should be obvious, we need a much stronger global WHO. And that means every country has to cooperate. It needs far more resources. It needs the ability to coordinate vaccine development, research into disease, just to get rid of some old scourges. We're close to getting rid of malaria. Think of that, incredible achievement. And we will do that much better together. But for that to happen, the West and China has to agree on a new program for the WHO, new resources, new governance, which makes it credible to both sides. And that's not the situation now. So health is a big climate. The West is moving towards accelerated carbon reduction. This needs to be accelerated much more. But I think China is going to have to offer to do more, and substantially more. It's inevitable, given that it's the world's largest emitter by far, and it emits so much coal. So it uses so much coal. So there's going to have to be a round of negotiations in which both sides give a lot. Otherwise, the planet is going to fry. At the moment, we're not going to resolve these problems. So there is a whole range of concrete, specific global challenges in which solutions will only arrive with very deep cooperation. And at the moment, I'm not going to say who's at fault. It's not really happening. It's not really happening. Will it happen? I don't know. It's very difficult. The relations in the US and China at the moment, pretty clearly from the meeting they had up in Alaska, I think it was Alaska, it's pretty bad, but that's the future. And both sides are going to have to give. I mean, that's the reality. Both sides are going to have to give, including China. That's where we are. I think it's crucial to understand, and I think it's the one thing on which we completely agree, is that where we are now is not very satisfactory. And it's getting worse. And it's getting worse quite quickly.
I agree with you. I agree with you. Actually, you partly answered the second media outlet, the China Radio International, actually asked about this Belt and Road question you were giving in that this part of talk. You talk about that. So probably we could multilize, Belt and Road, and maybe join the Paris Club and make it more transparent, and then let's have a collective interest. We are lacking a big global initiative in the next 30, 40 years or 75 years, because infrastructure, AIB could be upgraded to global infrastructure, but then maybe combine that with Belt and Road, multilateralization could be one possibility with the WHO improvement and WTO enhancement and all those things. We need to strengthen the global governance system. There's another question from China Business Network. Talk about the EU cooperation with Biden. You see, there's a EU-US relation. There's a EU-China relation. China has CAI, a comprehensive investment treaty, EU between China and EU. Now have a little challenge, and ideologically, value-wise, EU is more lean towards US, but economically, all those big European companies are having big headway in China. The only company profitable in China than their own countries, hugely. I mean, big time. And also UK. I mean, China and UK. I mean, Bruce Johnson said, the global Britain. I mean, if UK is left the EU, if you look beyond EU, maybe should look far east to China. So economically, US, China, EU, and UK, this may be the final question for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to go and do something else. I think the way things are evolving at the moment, Europe has economic relations with both sides, US and China, and would like to preserve good relations with both. I think it's generally the case. That's point one. Point two, ever since the Second World War, Europe's security has been guaranteed by the Americans, and that has not changed. That has not changed. And relations with security issues have become more important, particularly vis-a-vis Russia. Again, that may be right or wrong, but that's how it's perceived. So the security relationship is very important. So if the relations between the US and China get worse, Europe will be pulled towards the US. That's just inevitable. How far they will be pulled depends on how relations in the US and China unfold and how potentially damaging the economic evolution will be, which is not clear. So this is uncertain. But I would add finally that while you're absolutely right, Europeans are have a huge interest in China, there is also a lot of stress in European business about their relations with and operations in China on intellectual property issues, on equal treatment issues, and indeed whether they will be allowed in the long run really to prosper in China. There's lots, you just talk to Western businesses, they all have lots of questions about how viable this, not all to the same degree, some are much more successful than others, but a lot of them are really quite anxious about it. So the European business, both US and American businesses are very split now in their view of their relations with China. Some are still wildly enthusiastic and feel there's a tremendous potential, and others much less so. And that has shown up in the politics of this. So one of the things I think China has to ask itself is, are we treating Western businesses in a way that makes them feel they really have a deep stake in the future of China, a productive, profitable stake? And I would say, I don't do business, so I'm just reporting, that the views of Western businesses on this are very mixed, very mixed. So one of the priorities for China, if it wants to do what you say it does, to prevent a Western alliance against it economically, I'm not talking about other, economically, which at least will be damaging, even though China will surely survive, is to ask, well, are we handling this as well as we possibly could? Are we persuading Western businesses that they have a profitable, safe, secure, protected future, protected as far as intellectual property and so forth is concerned, in China? And if not, what can we do about it? No, and I think the answer is it only in part do people feel this confidence. So there's a geopolitical element, the Western Security Alliance, but there's also an economic element. A number of Western leaders, not all, least in Germany, which is the most important, a number of Western leaders think that the economic relation is not as good as they would like. So that has to be dealt with from China's point of view. Of course, there's just as much concern on the Chinese part. I mean, I understand, I've spoken to Huawei, I understand how they feel too. This is very complicated. But at the moment, where will Europe go? If America is led by somebody like Biden, they will, I think, go with the Americans. But of course, Biden's future is quite uncertain. And if it's Trump, anybody like Trump, it's completely different. We've got a crisis in the West. Obviously, there's a crisis in the West, and that will obvious to every Chinese person who thinks about it. And obviously that shapes the options that China will have. But again, let me stress the really big point. China, since I'm addressing a Chinese audience, I would say quite different things. I'm addressing a Western audience. In a Chinese audience, China needs to convince people around the world, particularly in the Western countries, that it is a completely open, fair, equal, reliable partner. And it has done so to a very substantial degree, but in my view, not enough. And this is more important now than it was 20 years ago, because China is so much more important itself than it was. And if people have a defensive attitude to China, the globalization you want to see and I want to see will not happen.
China, UK, and you have any words on that?
Yeah, the UK, I can't predict the UK. Okay. But everything I said about Europe is even more. The UK has gone sort of crazy from my point of view. I'm well known to be against Brexit. But again, I think the view that the UK had in 5 years ago has changed. Because the divisions between the Western world, above all the US and China, have been growing, the US now feels it can't have both equally. That's the problem. People are beginning to feel all over the world, we have to make a choice. Now, some countries are clearly going to choose one way or the other. You know, it's obvious because it's overwhelming. For Britain, the simple truth is that our relations with the United States across the whole board, political, strategic, economic, cultural, linguistic, are so close. I mean, obviously so close that if we are really forced to choose by the Americans or the Chinese, more likely by the Americans, we will always choose America, even if it makes us poorer. And I think actually we can't do anything else. We made a conscious choice in the, not really one we could have made any other, 100 years ago, the end of the First World War, reinforced by the end of the Second World War, that Britain was part of the American system and it was our guarantor and our closest ally. And if you think about the history of the two countries, it was a British colony. It's inevitable that that will be the case. So if it really gets to the choice, Britain will go with America. I mean, it's just absolutely obvious. 50 years from now, America goes into total collapse and China is the dominant power in the world in all respects. Well, it could be different, but we're not there that. So we're going to be like Europe, but even more so, particularly because we don't really have a strong base in Europe. And so we are much weaker than we used to be.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, thank you. I think that's what I can understand why this G7 foreign minister held in London now, the UK is playing a very active role on that. Well, I think we had a very fascinating discussion, Martin. I mean, thank you for taking your precious time. And we got over 1 million viewers. We have several social media portals and Baidu and many others podcast this live channel, CGT and everything. So it's great. We had this frank discussion. And we talked about pandemic fighting, the world economic trend and the future development, globalization, where you are so familiar with, and also how can we improve the globalization in the future. And of course, we talk about also the peaceful rise of China and how we can peacefully coexist it, and the advantage and disadvantage and the competitive advantage of each other, and where we can maintain that, and how can we avoid this hideous trap and also be really a partner, even if it's a rivalry partnership. So cooperative rivalry probably is better word. So I think, we cover a lot of ground, and finally, WTO, AIB and WHO and China, UK, China, EU. So wide ranging, we're going to digest that, and we're going to really make a great study of that as well. I mean, our think tank, we're really going to sort of all those ideas and then we're going to well document that. So thank you so much for taking your time, and I hope next time when you we invite you come to Beijing and then speak at the CCG, and appreciate your time. So your final word to our audience before we close. Yes.
Well, as you said, this has been a long and very deep discussion. I think fairly frank, and I've enjoyed it enormously. I believe in globalization, and I believe in the management of our shared planet. It's our destiny and our duty to manage this planet in such a way that we transmit it to future generations in a good state. And it has many huge challenges. The relations between China and the West will play an enormous part in determining how this plays out over the next decades and indeed possibly centuries. I'm a Westerner. I have very strong attachment to core Western values, and that's inevitable, and I think right. But I think I do so without any illusions about what the West has done, Western history, its faults and crimes. But I am a Westerner, and I don't want to give up on our core values: individual liberty, the law, and democracy. But the great threat to that is internal, not from anyone else. But those frictions of power and ideas between the West and China will continue. I think that's absolutely clear. But I also think they're manageable, because what we share, that's the key point, is more important than what divides us. What do we share? We're all human. We all want to lead better lives. We all want peace, I think. And we want our children and grandchildren, in my case, I have lots of grandchildren, to live fulfilled lives into the next century. And that will demand close, intelligent cooperation between us. And that will make really big demands on both sides, on both China and the West. We're going to have to do things differently by taking into account the views and interests of each other in a way that is very unnatural for great powers. But it is, particularly great powers which are divided in so many ways by history and culture. But I think it's possible. Indeed, not only is it possible, it is absolutely essential. The alternative is truly catastrophe. If we end up in a fundamentally ineradicably conflictual relationship, we will not be able to manage the world, and at worst, we will destroy it. So what is at stake here is all our futures of everybody we care about.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. You said something very profound there. We're all human beings. We are all living in the same planet. We are all global villagers. We need to look for a better future and also manage our differences and coexist peacefully and strive for the better future. Thank you so much for taking time talking to us. Thank you very much, Martin. Yeah. Appreciate it.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.